fully comprehend the film. Evers, X, and King were all prominent civil rights activists that worked to fight the injustices against black people in America due to racism. Malcolm X took a more radical approach and believed in self-defense of blacks in the face of white violence. Martin Luther King Jr. had a more peaceful approach throughout nonviolence protests. Medgar Evers took an economic approach to fighting racism through boycotts. Despite their different approaches to fighting oppression, all three of them were assassinated. More historical context throughout the film is segregation as a whole. It is seen in many ways throughout the film and is a key struggle leaders were fighting against during this time. Segregation caused blacks to have inferior amenities at white establishments, but at the same time, it gave blacks the opportunity to create their own businesses, schools, and neighborhoods. Segregation also caused a lot of violence towards blacks if whites perceived they were stepping out of their designated boundaries. Understanding segregation helps to understand the documentary because it explains what was going on during the time period and why these three men were willing to die for their people. Some social context from modern times were also shown. Footage from violent protests in Baltimore and Ferguson after the death of young black men were shown in the film. We also hear Baldwin speak about the condition of black people in this country and how the fight is not over. We must understand the social context of today shown through these protests to see that there is still injustice for blacks in America. Understanding the historical and social context throughout the film helped to understand the documentary as a whole because you can understand the motives behind the actions of Baldwin and his peers. Also, if we understand the past, we also have a better grasp on the present and how history has affected what is going on today.
When reflecting on all the material we studied closely in this course, it made it very easy to make connections throughout this documentary in regards to social historical events, as well as comparing them to several concepts and staple events that transpired in the wake of the civil rights movement. The lack of tolerance for blacks during the civil rights movement, as well as the absence of the representative democracy and the birth of various black organizations are a few of the things that I will be speaking on that help me better understand the elements of this documentary. The lack of tolerance after the abolishment of slavery was one of the main things I feel like that stuck out in this course, being that it's the violence that blacks faced when they were desegregating school, the violence that blacks faced when they were boycotting, the violence blacks faced for doing nothing at all, just simply living and being black during this time period. And this documentary did a great job by putting a name and a face with these unfortunate events that blacks experienced by using examples such as Dorothy Counts, the hatred and the resistance she met just from entering a predominantly white school, the murder of Martin Luther King, the murder of Malcolm X, the murder of lots of blacks simply wanting to make a difference and have a voice. And reading about these elements throughout the course, as well as watching other documentaries, definitely helped me better understand what was transpiring in this documentary in regards to this particular time period. The fact that there was no representative democracy backing black people during this time period had also had a lot to do with this documentary and things that we learned in this course, simply because a lot of racist officials were elected during this time period who established things like Jim Crow laws or who turned the other cheek to the violence that was being put on blacks during this time period. People who were afraid to support the civil rights movement based on the violence they feared they would face. It was just a lot of things politically that set back blacks simply because of who was in place and simply because they didn't support the idea of the advancement of blacks. And reading and learning about these things in this course helped me better understand the documentary, again, because it put a lot of things that I was witnessing into perspective and helped me understand better the background of what I was seeing versus this information being presented to me for the first time. I already knew a lot about it, so I was able to make those connections. The birther groups such as the SCLC, the Black Panthers, the NAACP was a huge staple in the civil rights movement, being that each group had different ideologies that they shared and that they expressed, and that they formed groups who supported these different ideologies. And a lot of these elements were fairly presented throughout the documentary, primarily between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. The idea that Martin Luther King was an Uncle Tom simply because he was a firm believer of Christianity and the nonviolent approach, whereas Malcolm X was more so like the any means necessary type. Violence is going to be met with violence. They don't want to worship the same God that whites worship. They all felt like it was a way for whites to continue to keep that power over us. And learning about the varying ideologies of the Black Panthers and the NAACP and Martin Luther King's teachings really helped me understand and put into perspective why Malcolm X thought the way he did and why Martin Luther King thought the way he did, simply because they had to get the advancement of blacks, to get fair treatment, to change the way things were. Learning about the rule of law and how it was set in place to pretty much mandate that man has laws he needs to abide by, and to see that handled, it was often led to no charges. It also often led to pretty much a free-for-all. People could do whatever they wanted to blacks with no penalty. And if I hadn't learned about that, I wouldn't have really understood why this was happening. Why was it legal to kill blacks? Why was it legal to spit on and abuse and beat blacks during this time period?
The documentary I Am Not Your Negro with James Baldwin, I really thought it was a very powerful one, and I thought that we could definitely relate it to what we learned in the class, and it did help me expand the concepts that I learned. It definitely opened up very powerful. James Baldwin was asked the question, why aren't blacks more optimistic? We have these blacks are now in Congress, and, they're becoming politicians, and Baldwin's answer was very realistic, and I felt like it was also powerful when he said, I don't think it's hope for us as black people, as long as people use this peculiar language saying, that black people aren't optimistic. He also said it's not a question of what will happen to the Negro, it's about what will happen to this country. So I thought that was very important when he said that. I could relate it to the first module when we talked about, slavery, in terms of violence, the violence towards, Medgar Evans and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. We still face that same violence today with police brutality. So when he was speaking about, the neighborhoods that blacks are put in, I thought that could definitely relate to a lot of the things that we learned in the class. So I thought by him expanding on that, I had a better understanding of why African Americans continue to be the way that they are today because of the environments that they are put in. So it definitely helped me to learn the concept of social conditions and economic conditions as well.
The documentary did a great job at capturing the essence of James Baldwin in a very artistic way. The documentary did a great job at capturing the essence of James Baldwin in a very artistic way. The film was a combination of video of James Baldwin's life, news clips, and other footage from the 1950s through 1970s. It was an excellent visual representation of James Baldwin's words and did justice to the book Remember This House. It was beneficial for us to watch this film because it gave us a clear understanding of the social climate of racist America. The film integrated footage from the past with footage from modern times. This helped us understand that although James Baldwin was talking about these issues over 50 years ago, they are still relevant today. These issues are still going on, and there is still no justice and full equality for African Americans in this country. Watching this movie truly helped us understand this concept because as James Baldwin's words were being spoken, there were images from modern times being shown on the screen that fully represented what was being said. This shows us that we have a long way to go. Taking this course helps us understand the past so we can apply what we learned to the future and hopefully bring change to the injustices that still occur towards African Americans.